Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Simone Lässig, and as the director of the German Historical Institute, Washington, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the second installment of our panel series, Racism in History and Context. The GHI is a Center for Advanced Historical Research. It is one of the 10 institutes that make up the Max Weber Foundation. And while each institute has its own focus and research agenda, all institutes share the common goal of fostering scholarly dialogue and cooperation across national borders. Towards that end, the GHI organizes a broad array of seminars, workshops, and conferences that bring together researchers from around the world, above all from Europe and the Americas. But even though research is our top priority, we believe that it is crucial for professional historians to share their experience with the public at large. For that reason, the GHI regularly organizes events that are open to the public. But we are interested in more than just public outreach. These programs are intended as contributions to ongoing debates about the challenges confronting our societies. And I can tell you there's no doubt here we live in a time that challenges us in a special way and that creates an almost unprecedented demand for orientation. And our panel series on racism in history and context reflects this demand. While the first panel we organized in this series discussed memory and knowledge in times of crisis, today's panel explores the intersection of two other hotly debated issues at present, race and the politics of health and well-being. My colleagues Eva Schlotheuber and Akasemi Newsome will say more about this topic and about our panelists and moderators in a moment. Like many public events at the GHI, this panel series is a collaborative effort. I want to express my gratitude to our two partners in this venture, the Institute of European Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and the German Historical Association. Let me also voice my thanks to our panelists, to our moderators, and to everyone who participated in the organization of today's discussion, especially Elisabeth Engel, Heike Friedman, and Frank Kell. And I thank, of course, all of you in the virtual audience for your interest in our panel and for taking the time. I look forward to our discussion about health and power during times of crisis, and now turn matters over to Eva Schlotheuber. Eva, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Simone. Hello, also from my side. My name is Eva Schlotheuber. I'm the chairwoman of the German Historical Association, which represents German historical scholarship in the public and in the academia. I'm delighted to welcome you, our participants and viewers, to today's panel discussion, Rethinking Health and Power During Times of Crisis. This is the second part of our virtual panel series, Racism in History and Context, and we initiated it to provide the possibility to discuss together the recent groundbreaking developments in the US and in Europe. I'm very happy we do have an all-female panel, which was not planned from the outset, but just turned out to be that way. Racism can take on many forms, which are sometimes easy to recognize. This is why reflection from an overarching and comparative perspective are so important. In Germany, for example, racism often manifests itself as anti-Semitism or as a kind of an everyday racism in which labor migration has a reinforcing effect. The dynamics of inequalities can vary a lot in different social and national contexts, although they all have in common that ethnic and racial minorities are disproportionately exposed to the risk of physical harm, right now due to the pandemic and to public violence. In this regard, and in many others, the pandemic acts as a reinforcing factor. I do think it's crucial for us to understand really what's going on. That's why we today want to look together at possible interrelationships and differences from the perspective of history and sociology. We therefore invited from the US and also from Europe scholars and from various fields to explore the history of racism that have been constructed in current multi-layered crisis. I look very much forward to our discussion and now turn it over to Akasemi, who will introduce the panelists for today.
Thank you to Eva and Simona, and welcome. My name is Akasemi Newsome, and I'm the Associate Director of the Institute of European Studies at UC Berkeley. So for the second installment of our Racism in History and Context series, we have brought together an exciting panel of experts for conversation with each other and two able moderators. These scholars will grapple with the deep roots of our current health crisis and the endemic police violence and past legacies of racist state violence and disease outbreaks around the world. Now to our panelists. Manuela Boatca is a professor of sociology and head of school of the Global Studies program at the University of Freiburg in Germany. Her work deals with world systems analysis, post-colonial and decolonial perspectives, gender and modernity and coloniality, and the geopolitics of knowledge production in Eastern Europe and Latin America. Teresa Koloma Beck is a sociologist studying globalization and everyday life under conditions of crisis. Since 2017, she's been a professor for the sociology of globalization at Bundeswehr University in Munich. For her work on everyday life in internationalized armed conflicts and post-war societies, she's undertaken ethnographic field research in Angola, Mozambique, and Afghanistan. Monica Muñoz Martinez is an associate professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin. She's the author of the award-winning book, The Injustice Never Leaves You, Anti-Mexican Violence in Texas, and is also the primary investigator for Mapping Violence, Racial Terror in Texas, 1900 to 1930, which is a digital research project that recovers histories of racial violence in Texas. Kathryn Olivarius is a historian of 19th century America, interested primarily in the antebellum South, Greater Caribbean, slavery, and disease. She joined the faculty at Stanford University in 2017, right after she received her DPhil in history from the University of Oxford. The panel will be moderated by Elisabeth Engel, who's a research fellow at the German Historical Institute, Washington, D.C. She's a scholar of U.S. religious and economic history in the 19th and 20th century. And our second moderator is Leti Volpp, who joined the Berkeley Law faculty in 2005. She researches immigration and citizenship law with a particular focus on how law is shaped by ideas of culture and identity. Now I'm going to turn it over to Leti to start our panel.
So I'm so happy to be here and for what I know will be an amazing discussion. We wanted to begin by pointing to the urgency of these issues in the contemporary moment. The US election is next Tuesday. Europe is entering another pandemic lockdown. Coronavirus deaths in the United States have now topped 225,000 people. And on Monday, police in Philadelphia killed Walter Wallace Jr. in the latest episode of this form of state violence. I know our panel will help us better comprehend the dynamics of health, power, and racism in these and other contexts. So let me now turn it over to Elisabeth Engel to ask the first question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Welcome to everybody from me as well. I'm excited to have you all here. And as you know, this panel is focused on questions of health, power, and the history of racism. So as an introductory statement, would you please give the audience a sense of the geographical, temporal, and analytical scope of your work as it relates to these questions? And I'm going to ask Manuela to go first, please.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me on this panel. I'm really looking forward to engaging with everyone. As to the first question, how my geographical, temporal, analytical scope of work relates to health, power, and the history of racism, I have to begin by positioning myself. I was born and raised in Romania. To think that racism is a problem of distant parts of the world. That was not only a feature of state socialism in Romania, but also later in the 90s. So the idea was that racism is not a European reality, the way I was brought up. I migrated to Germany in the 1990s to study sociology, and the discussion in Germany was that racism was a thing of the past that was only restricted to Nazi Germany, and that the country was not even a country of immigration. So I realized that as a Romanian, I was not even European and sometimes not even white, or white but not quite in a German context. So it all didn't really make sense to me. I slowly became a scholar of global capitalism because I was interested in both the questions of labor and social change in Eastern Europe, in Romania, but more and more in the structural similarities with places like Latin America, which were not supposed to be connected to Eastern Europe, but through the lens of global capitalism, they are. And through that engagement, I started researching and teaching about the European colonization of the Americas, because global capitalism for me is defined from a world systems analysis perspective as being at least 500 years old. In that context, the question of enslavement and the question of the importance of health as a dimension of enslaving labor became more and more significant, although I would not describe myself as a health scholar. It is just indispensable to understanding capitalism to see how things like the fact that tropical commodities that were produced under enslavement changed the diet of the entire planet and created inequalities that are very much entangled between regions that seem to be very distant or disconnected. And the very well-known work of people like Sidney Mintz, who showed how sugar produced under enslaved labor in the Americas went into the diet of industrial workers in England, had a lot to do with the fact that other commodities from colonized regions travel to places like Eastern Europe. For instance, maize became the staple food in Romania and also kind of proletarian food. But it all had to do with the fact that colonialism and the relegation of certain commodities and certain foods to certain bodies made it possible for racialized bodies to be seen as worth less good food than others and to reproduce inequalities as a result. So this is a little bit how I come to the topic and how I try to make sense of it.
Thank you very much. Teresa, would you go next?
Yeah, I hadn't planned to position myself, but I will pick up on this idea by Manuela just by saying that I have been studying conflicts, and especially violent conflicts, since the beginning of my career, which is now 15 years ago. And I always had tried to stay away from these topics because for a long time, until very recently, it felt as if somebody like me would expose herself in so many ways, trying to address issues of racism. So it is a very recent change that I even feel within the realm of German-speaking academia that there is a place for people of color, Black people, by those people who are actually affected by racism, to have a place in research. And not only a place in political debate where they can, speak up and express or talk about their experiences, but actually have a place in research. This is in Germany a very recent development, and it has to do with what Manuela has just explained, that for a long time it was a non-topic, which has been addressed by historians as a historical thing, but not in the social sciences, at least not in the mainstream of social sciences. There have always been very brave people who try to do this, But it's only very recently that this changed. So my connection to this whole question comes from a different angle. So in the introduction, it has been said that I'm a sociologist specializing in the study of armed conflict and political violence. And I'm particularly interested in everyday life under the condition of violence, under the conditions of having to live with an existential threat. And my perspective on these issues is very much influenced by this ethnographic fieldwork that I have undertaken. How does this relate to the pandemic and questions of power and racism? So the conflicts that I have studied take place, of course, in the horizon of colonial and imperial history. And for this reason, racism and processes of racialization play, of course, an important role in these empirical field, but they do so in not only in very obvious ways, in the form of like obvious discriminatory practices that are also intentional, but also in surprising ways through practices that are at first glance very innocuous. And throughout these last months of the pandemic, I observed that on the level of everyday, so now speaking as a sociologist of everyday life, the responses to the crisis of the pandemic are in many regards similar to the responses to the crisis of war. Because structurally, they pose people in a structurally similar position. That is, people are confronted in their everyday life with a risk that is at the same time existential and immediate. And in the scenario of war, this risk is violence. In the scenario of the pandemic, it is a virus. And everyone, not just people who are specialists in something, not just soldiers or doctors, have to deal with this, but suddenly everyone has to deal with this. And the consequences of such a situation is what we can call a securitization of everyday life. So this means that the question of security becomes crucial for the organization of everyday activities for everyone. People try to reorganize their life around the risk, to continue as far as possible what they used to be doing, but modifying these practices in a way so as to avoid exposure to the risk of violence or the virus. And when people try to do this, something very interesting and also disconcerting happens, because to practically avoid these risks, people have to learn to identify dangerous situations. And frequently, that is like the common wisdom, dangerous situations are created by the presence of dangerous people, by people who are considered to be dangerous. So ordinary people learn to continuously screen their everyday environment for situations involving people from which they have to protect themselves. And this is where racialized and other stereotyping distinctions come to kick in. So they become part of very mundane strategies of protection. People try to translate very complex information about the dynamics of war or the dynamics of the pandemic. This is our scenario now. They try to translate them into pragmatic rules for everyday action and behavior. And so it happens that, for example, the information, the virus was first detected in Wuhan, translates into, oh, beware of people with East Asian features. They might be dangerous. Or the information that personal hygiene helps to contain the virus translates into something like beware of dirty people. And there is like an everyday knowledge about who are dirty people. For example, homeless people, sex workers, or the poor in general. So driven by a sense of immediate and existential threat and a perceived need of protection, ordinary people start to engage in racial profiling and other forms of discriminatory stereotyping. And in this process, existing discriminatory structures are re-articulated and sharpened. And this is as such already worrying, But it is particularly worrying because much of this happens on a pre-conscious level. And this makes it very difficult to address these dynamics of discrimination in the political or the public sphere.
Thank you so much. Monica, would you go next?
Yes, hello, good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everybody. I'm so thrilled to be a part of this panel and to have been invited. Thank you to the moderators and to the organizers and to the other panelists. This is a really urgent conversation. I'm a historian of race and memory in the United States. And in particular, I focus on the history of state-sanctioned racial violence in the early 20th century, but I trace the legacies of racial violence and violent policing throughout the 20th century. And so I'm interested today in speaking about the connections between the history of anti-Latinx and anti-immigrant violence and how it's shaped our cultural and social institutions and the deep roots that our policing institutions have in the US-Mexico border, actually. So my first book focused on the history of anti-Mexican violence along the US-Mexico border, and more specifically in Texas. And when people tend to think about the history of racism in the United States, people tend to think about it along a white and black binary. And so in my work, I'm trained as a historian, but also in ethnic studies, and thinking about the intersections of broader histories of white supremacy and how it manifested in different forms, targeting different groups, different geographies and time periods. When I think about a place like Texas, it's a unique place to study the history of racial violence because it's a place in the American South and the American Southwest that also borders a foreign country. And so there's a long history, the history of anti-Native genocide and conquest, the history of anti-Mexican violence through conquest, and the history of slavery all intersect in Texas. And Texas is also a place where on the US-Mexico border, Chinese exclusion was also enforced. And so you had law enforcement agents also policing Asian migrants. So this is a place where we can study how nation building actually takes place by creating and policing international borders, but also creating these boundaries of belonging. And so that American in the early 20th century was assumed to be white, and racial and ethnic minorities, even European ethnic minorities, were policed and considered foreign. So in the early 20th century, when we think about anti-Mexican violence in particular, it was a period that most people don't know about, but ethnic Mexicans, both American citizens and Mexican nationals, were violently policed by law enforcement agents, in some cases by state police officers, by Anglo vigilantes, and also by US soldiers. And so what this means is that hundreds of ethnic Mexicans were lynched by mobs in Texas in the late 19th and early 20th century. It also means that just in the decade between 1910 and 1920, when the US government was trying to create the border to make it a real international boundary, that between 1910 and 1920, hundreds more Mexican men, women, and children were murdered by law enforcement and by vigilantes, and there were no prosecutions. So this was really an era where aggressors enjoyed a culture of impunity. And what this meant was that Texas Rangers, for example, the state police officers, were called on by politicians and by local residents and by the media to police violently. And when they did so, they racialized Mexicans as a national threat, as a threat to Americans, as dirty, as people who potentially brought disease. And so what you saw was the development of a federal police force and state and local police forces, but you also saw the medicalization of the border, so that the infrastructure to control racialized bodies was developed in the early 20th century. And so you saw this in the form of violent policing, but you also saw this in the form taking shape as quarantine centers on the border that required people entering the United States to be bathed in kerosene and deloused just to enter into the United States. And so in this moment of, this decade was also in the context of World War I, where the United States was developing itself, the reputation as being a deep beacon of democracy. And US soldiers were training to developing combat skills to enter World War I. And so those contradictions of the kinds of denying people due process, assuming guilt, and the calls for violent policing created the conditions that meant that anybody who looked Mexican was not safe from violence. And so, gender, age, citizenship, class did not protect people. And in my own work, I'm struck also by Teresa's presentation and her work, because I consider not just the climate of violence, but also the aftermath. So thinking about people who lived in a climate of terror, documenting the work of widows who sought justice, and journalists who tried to raise attention and cry out, politicians who called and named the injustices and tried to bring about police reform, and the ways that those people were also criminalized and threatened by state governments and by powerful figures. And so if we think about this history of anti-Mexican violence, there's three really important historical lessons. One is that anti-immigrant and anti-Mexican rhetoric led to violence that was state sanctioned and violence by vigilantes. The second point is that this anti-Mexican sentiment not only resulted in extralegal violence and vigilante violence, but also shaped policy, immigration policies and policing policies. And third, that in this climate of racial terror, although there were people who sought justice and tried to make real reform, state powers and federal powers confronted with calls to make police reforms or to change immigration policies, instead doubled down and used police to undermine civil rights efforts. And so the consequences of that meant that the US Border Patrol, for example, was founded by representatives who called for racial violence and testified publicly and said things like, you've got to shoot Mexicans when you see them, right? This is the Congressman Hudspeth, Claude B. Hudspeth, who made sure that in the 1924 Immigration Act that funding for the US Border Patrol was included. And so the institutions today, the policing practices that we see today, unfortunately have their roots in this very bloody history of racial violence.
Thank you so much, Monica. And Kathryn, please.
Hi, everyone. It's an absolute honor to be with you all today. And, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. We're all over the place right now. So I'm a historian of the 19th century South, particularly the Deep South. So this is New Orleans and its environs. And I study how yellow fever impacted the society and how the society created an entrenched economic, social, and racial inequality through disease. So this is quite a different world to the one that we are currently living in right now, but there are some very striking similarities. So I was not always this kind of historian. I went on my first research trip to Louisiana about a decade ago, and I wanted to study the sort of changing, how enslaved people experienced the sort of the change from French and Spanish colonial models of slavery to the American system after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. But what impressed me most when I was in the archives was how much people were obsessed with their health and disease. And they were obsessed with one disease in particular, yellow fever. So zooming out, I came to learn, I went to school in the UK, we didn't do any American history, but I came to learn that epidemics of yellow fever struck the American Deep South, particularly New Orleans, every 2 or 3 years. And so New Orleans was the sort of regional hub of the Cotton Kingdom. So within this city, these epidemics cumulatively killed about 150,000 people in the first 6 decades of the 19th century, and about 250,000 people across the entire Cotton Kingdom. The 1853 epidemic of yellow fever killed 12,000 people in New Orleans alone, which makes it still one of the worst natural disasters. If we can call it a natural disaster, we can talk more about why that is not necessarily an apt label, it's still in American history. So I think it's easy to write off a lot of this discussion, this discussion about yellow fever and epidemics and anxiety as background noise. But I came to see this more as sort of dark matter, that this was an essential part of life, even when epidemics were not actually present. These epidemics came in the summertime, even in the winter when there was not an epidemic. This came to sort of structure all sorts of aspects of society. And this was an essential part of life for all people in the antebellum South, and a key aspect for the kind of society, the commodities, the capitalism, and specifically the institution of racial slavery that came about here. So everyone was absolutely petrified by this disease. There was no cure, there was no vaccination, there was no conclusive evidence of disease transmission, there was no satisfactory explanation for why it killed some people while it left others seemingly unaffected. And it was a very horrible way to die, with victims famously vomiting up this black, sort of coagulated blood, which looked like coffee grounds at the end. And moreover, this problem was worsening as time went on due to a massive influx of immigration, both free and enslaved immigration. So this is New Orleans is the regional hub of, this is the sort of national hub of the entire domestic slave trade. And it's also the second biggest immigrant destination after New York City, precisely because it does not have health checks, in fact, the Port of New Orleans. So the elites of the society, these are white cotton planters, these are white sugar planters, these are merchants and enslavers and politicians. They come to accept two things as I see it. First, they come to accept that they could do nothing to fix the yellow fever problem. Public health solutions that might work elsewhere, like quarantines or sanitation, even little things, would have no effect in a city sitting just 1 foot above sea level, they argued. And the second thing that they came to accept was that public health was what they called private acclimation so-called. So it was everyone's individual duty here to fall sick with yellow fever and survive it and become acclimated and gain lifetime immunity. So this is very, very risky because people had about a 50% chance of dying from yellow fever who contracted it in the 19th century. But with this knowledge that survivors were safe, Orleanians generated this kind of invisible epidemiological hierarchy, which commingled with and exacerbated the existing racial hierarchy of white people, free Black people, and enslaved people. So here, so-called sort of acclimated citizens, what they called survivors, were at the top of this structure, of this sort of society. And they were followed by unacclimated strangers, so-called, these people who were in the sort of limbo or purgatory awaiting their brush with this disease. And these groups were followed by the dead, those people in the local logic without sufficient bravery or morality to survive. So immunity, even though it was invisible and impossible to verify because they didn't have blood testing at this time, immunity really mattered. So if you were unacclimated and if you were white, you could not get insurance, you could not marry, you could not live in certain places, you could not get credit, you could not find employment. Oftentimes you could not vote. This was one of the first questions when you went for a job interview that your acclimation status would be the first question that you would be asked about. And immunity opened doors for white people. For whites, acclimation was classified as a so-called baptism of citizenship. And it was sort of treated as a credential, a kind of springboard to social and economic advancement in this place. And for whites who survived yellow fever, this became a kind of moral or patriotic stamp that a newcomer had rolled the epidemiological dice that they had chosen to survive. And this person was now considered to be worthy of investment. So all of the richest and most powerful white people in the society incorporated their successful acclimations into their genesis stories. This may sound somewhat familiar to right now. So if the difference between stigma and privilege was surviving a disease, it was no wonder that people actively sought sickness. So I've seen examples, for example, of people injecting black vomit into their veins, hoping to get sick, or eating black vomit, hoping to get sick, or jumping into their dead friends' beds, rolling around in their bed sheets, hoping to get sick. This is, remember, 50-50 chance of death. This is very, very, very risky. But here's the most important way that humans manipulated unthinking biology for unequal and white supremacist ends. So pro-slavery theorists in the 19th century argued that all Black people were naturally resistant to yellow fever or immune to yellow fever, and that God had given, and this is in the sort of language of the day, that God had made Black people immune specifically so that they would be the primary laborers in the American South. This is not true. There is no epidemiological basis for hereditary resistance to yellow fever. But with this claim of Black immunity, slavery then by these pro-slavery thinkers could be justified on a massive scale because Black people could then do all sorts of labor in dangerous spaces. So on the levee, in docklands, on sugar plantations, labor that white people claimed would kill them. So yellow fever was just thus used as as a scientific justification for expanding America's slave system. But of course, enslavers contradicted themselves, as they do in many things, showing that they did not actually believe this idea of Black immunity precisely. So they insisted that any person that they bought in the slave market of New Orleans would be had to be guaranteed acclimated, and they were willing to pay between 25 and 50% more. So you could ask, how could enslavers say one thing and do another? How could they claim that all Black people were naturally immune to yellow fever, but then also insist that, you know, in the slave market that the Black people they are purchasing and enslaving have this credential? So enslavers and white slaveholders did this all the time. They're very contradictory people. But even white people who did not own slaves, and even unacclimated white people who lived in absolute terror of this disease, bought into immunocapital, this and the system, this hierarchy that it created, because immunological discrimination and became just one more form of bias in this society, which was essentially premised on extreme violence, legally sanctioned violence, and racial inequality. So mosquitoes may have been equal opportunity vectors, but human beings made sure that their workings were anything but colorblind.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for these exciting, brief, cursory introductions to your research, which offer fantastic perspectives. And I will turn over to my co-moderator, Leti, now.
So I actually wish we could hear from each of you for the full period of time. You each do such amazing work. So before I turn to my question, I just want to mention an audience member actually already has started doing this, but for everybody who's in the audience, we are hoping to have a Q&A period during this session, and you can post any question, any comment you might have in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So we're hoping that you might turn this very rich research that you have in historical or other contemporary contexts to particular present day issues. And so my question is to think about historical trajectories of racism and how they shape present events. So from the perspective of your research, what connections might you draw between these historical trajectories of racism and the COVID-19 pandemic crisis? And I actually would like to turn first to Teresa. And you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, as I already explained in my research, the question of racial discrimination appears as part of the dynamics of securitization in everyday life. So people who are looking for orientation and action and then resort to racialized patterns of perception and observation. And I think this highlights to what extent racism is embedded in pragmatic forms of knowledge. And this is something, and in ways people are not even aware of. And I think this is something which, especially in the German context, maybe in the European context in more general, but then already France is different from Germany because colonial history is different. But so thinking of racism as something that is embedded in pragmatic forms of knowledge, and pragmatic forms of knowledge are always a product of learning processes over time, and the time period that we are looking at can be can go back in history for quite a while. So I think in Germany this is particularly relevant because racism used to be a non-topic. I've seen that in the Q&A, this has already been challenged. Maybe we can get into this a bit more, but I would completely agree with Manuela in saying that there was for a long time this understanding that racism is something that relates to conscious attitudes and intentional forms of action. And since the end of World War II, this is not a problem in Germany because Germans have learned their lessons from history. And of course, there are always a few people, but these are basically unteachable relicts, and you don't have to worry too much about them because they will disappear very soon. And the very idea that racism is something that could be structurally embedded in social processes and relations, in structures of knowledge, that racism exists beyond explicit racist attitudes, that it exists, for example, also in technological infrastructures and organizational infrastructures. This is considered by many still as insulting. And in Germany, you could witness this in the last week. After demands have been made, so the Black Lives Matters movement also was received in Germany, was carried on in Germany. There have been protests and there have been images in this demonstration of police violence, so video clips, not as we have seen them in the US, but shocking for a German context. There have been other videos appearing about situations of controls made based on racial profiling. And then there have been demands for a scientific study that addresses the question of the relevance of racism in police work. And the way this demand has been received, the outrage it provoked among those who felt they have to protect the police, in my sense, especially revealed a basic lack of understanding what racism is. So that it is not just about people who have racist ideologies and know about it, but that it is really a structure of knowledge, a structure of relations that has been formed in history and is relevant in Germany too, even though, as Germans like to point out, the colonial history of Germany didn't have the extent as the colonial history of France or the United States or Great Britain. So this dimension of racism as knowledge, as a pragmatic knowledge that is formed in historical processes, is maybe the way it appears most strongly in my own analysis of ongoing conflicts today.
Thank you, Teresa. Maybe we'll turn to Manuela to continue talking perhaps about the German context. And if you want to talk about historical trajectories of racism in the COVID-19 context, or if you want to also bring in the question of police state violence, as Teresa did, that's fine as well.
I'll try to link them, but I'll start with your original question, because the clearest connection that I see between historical trajectories of racism and present events is that racism makes structural vulnerability appear as fate. There's always a naturalization of race and of the hierarchies, the racial hierarchies, as natural. So that naturalization makes whatever vulnerability it becomes more apparent in times of crisis deserved. So to say, you are shaping your own fate, and this is fate. And we've already heard on great detail from Kathryn how basically the racialized are always associated with infection, and actually from Monica too. But the discourse is larger, right? The association with infection, lack of civilization, closeness to nature, and it is contradictory. And my colleagues have already pointed that out, because on the one hand, the idea is that the racialized, the racial other, is closer to nature, that is closer to the animal reign, but at the same time is immune. So the immunity gives them some sort of power. What that means, and what that has historically meant, is that health is a necessary dimension for exploiting labor. And that is something that has been documented really for the history of the European trade in enslaved people. Walter Rodney pointed out that the health insurance of the 17th century was that the enslaved who were being sold on the market had smallpox marks. So that meant they had immunity to European diseases and could thus survive the Middle Passage. The idea was then that their exploitation could be justified as something that is closer to their physical capabilities, so they're physically stronger, and that makes them not only survive the Middle Passage, but make them do more arduous labor than the indigenous people of the Americas, which was a complete construction. The only reason why Africans were immune to some European diseases were the Portuguese explorations of the coast of Africa in the 14th and 15th century. But constructing that as a sort of lack of vulnerability associated with immunity made a racial argument that some bodies are more prone to being enslaved than others at least logical stretch. It made that logical stretch possible. Now, we still see that logical stretch today. When Eastern European workers were brought to Germany, France, and UK in the early months of the pandemic, some actually serious newspapers claimed that Eastern Europeans have stronger backs and they don't mind picking asparagus, strawberries, or whatever for longer hours, whereas the British cannot because they are more prone to disease. So that it's striking to me how these kinds of connections resurrect after, I don't know, maybe not only in times of crisis, but in such times of crisis, it's very useful to have a pool of arguments that you can pick from that resonate with people, because it's not the first time they hear that the racial other is stronger, that they're further away from civilization, that they don't have the needs for cleanliness, for protection, so they can take it, basically. And this kind of argument was not only made, but is, I think, still being discussed as the reason why the exposure to the elements and the kind of cramped housing of workers in Western Europe, and among others, Germany, is not something that was conducive to more disease among agricultural workers, whereas it was. But yeah, for a long time, that kind of argument was and still is dominant. That is related to maybe the question that was asked and that Teresa already have answered for me. The idea that the discourse on race in Germany was a non-topic, of course. So I didn't mean to say that this was a fact, only that you could not enter that discussion legitimately, and let alone as a foreigner, let alone as somebody who didn't have citizenship, you could not come into Germany and claim that you know that there's actually racism going on that is not related to Nazi Germany. Because not only was competence denied to you, but it was outrageous. It was not, in my discipline, it was not sociological to talk about it. It was out of the question. And even if in the around 2000, when the idea was being discussed whether Germany is even a country of immigration, immigration was already a problem. Where do you come from speaking about racism? You know, that is outrageous. And I'm so happy that this has been changing dramatically, but still by far not as much as needed. So I'll leave it at that in order not to take too much time.
Thank you, Manuela. I think in many ways what you just said flows into Kathryn's work. So I'm going to turn to Kathryn next.
Yes, and I'll keep it very brief. This is, I have felt myself nodding along as both of you were talking, thinking, yes, yes, yes. So I'm gonna tie this into a sort of particularly very modern conversation that we're having about in the United States, but not just in the United States, actually around the world, about immunity passports and the ways that we can reopen our economy and allow life to return to normal, which is a far cry. I think that we're not just we're not just a matter of months or a week. I think Trump said we're still it'll be just a couple of weeks from now. It won't be. Spoiler alert. We could be many years away from a vaccine. We don't even know how well this is going to work. One of the things that I think really, really strikes me about what you were saying, Manuela, too, is that is the role that the state plays in all of this as well. So immediately when this virus came into the United States, or it came to Europe, this was racialized as the China virus. It was always sort of considered to be this outside virus infecting, being brought in and imported. This was from the very, very beginning, and it was cultivated and done by quite literally, President Trump, which is, for a political end. Moreover, I think that this question, this question about immunity and people who are naturally safe, groups of people who are naturally safe or naturally more prone to it. This is, this is quite quite different from the antebellum American South, where 200 years later we know what germs are now. We were able to map the genome of COVID-19 almost instantaneously once it was discovered. But we're seeing a lot of this sort of same questions happening right now. And this, there's been a lot of language in the United States, but not just in the United States, in the UK as well and elsewhere, that it's about, we need to reopen the economy. So therefore it's about your individual risk, what you're willing to take on. And you need to make this sort of individual risk assessment. So be careful, but then really it's your sort of patriotic duty to go back out, spend money at restaurants, go face, go face down this disease so that we can all, go back to prosperity. I detest this language of personal risk assessment and this choice, this idea that somehow taking on disease risk is a choice. It may be, it might be for many of us on this call or many people around where I can sit at home, I can teach on Zoom, I can write my book at Zoom, on my computer, and I can retain health insurance in the United States. But of course, many people, disproportionately people of color, undocumented people in the United States, do not have the choice but to go back out to work. And that's not just taking on individual disease risk. That's taking on massive disease risk for communities, for families, for all sorts of people. And this is also not real choice. It's not a real choice if to say that you must go back out to work, that you can't feed your family otherwise, or you can't pay your rent otherwise. That's not a choice. And that this idea, this sort of language of this sort of gilding the lily with this language of moralism, of masculinity, sort of masculine honor, that you're brave and you're going to go out and risk this disease. This to me is, it sounds, it sounds an awful lot like, what Trump has been saying recently, and many of the many others have been saying recently about how, actually what happened when Trump fell ill with COVID-19 was he was brave and he had to face this disease. This to me sounds a lot like what people in the 1850s said in defending New Orleans, this massive slave society. It's the complete abdication also of state responsibility for individuals' health, and the complete abdication of saying that, we care about your health, and if you can't go back to work, we will make sure that you can still live comfortably, that you can feed your children, that you can that we have a proper welfare state. But I think we've seen with this pandemic, not only I guess especially in the United States, but in many places, in my other country, the UK as well, just how holy the safety net actually is, and how disproportionately the people who are most heavily impacted by this disease are people who have been racialized, people of color in the United States. And it's just, it feels like history is repeating itself in just a slightly different context.
Thank you, Kathryn. Monica, do you want to respond?
Yes, I mean, I have a lot to say because so much has been introduced. Yeah. It's really already a really dynamic conversation. I mean, I think one thing that I'm captivated by and that I think deserves some of our attention is not just to look at the numbers of brown and Black bodies that have been impacted by COVID-19 in the United States, the disproportionate numbers. And of course, this is coming back to Kathryn's point about who can make the choice to stay home and who has to put their bodies at risk. But that also comes back to the longer history of public tolerance for the suffering of Black and brown bodies. And so if we think about the early 20th century and the long history of racial violence in the United States, there's a long history of police brutality and mob violence that Black and Latinx organizers had to maintain a centuries-long campaign to try to end the suffering of Black and brown bodies at the hands of vigilantes and also of police. And we're seeing it again today, that there is a presumed division between us and them. And we could see early reporting in the United States, and we actually saw reporting too of conservative and right-wing extremists saying we don't need to have a federal or state response to COVID because it's mostly brown and Black people, and it's mostly poor people dying. And so that misunderstanding that the virus would spread, that it was not going to abide by the segregated societies that we have created. That when we saw this, the virus and the pandemic reaching the Midwest and reaching even the White House, the sort of narrative shifted so that you could see people then embracing this idea of bravery. And I'm going to not wear a mask as a sign of patriotism. And so I think it's really important for us to think about how long this virus was allowed to spread because people were not concerned with the brown and white and the brown and black bodies that were suffering. And we're seeing in places, again, along the US-Mexico border, in places like El Paso. I mean, I think about a place like El Paso, Texas, where this community has been hit by a series of the crises that we're talking about today. Not only today is our hospitals full, are local officials asking for access to the military hospitals for COVID-19 patients, but this is also a city that is still just trying to recover from being targeted by a white power domestic terrorist that committed a massacre in El Paso a year ago in September 2019. It's also a city that has been grappling with the aftermath of the of the Trump administration's family separation policy. This was one of the cities in which, hundreds of children would just be released by the U.S. government, and local residents would have to try to find how to provide shelter for these children. And ACLU and other pro bono lawyers, nonprofit legal teams have had to try to do the work of reuniting these families. And so it's one of these cities where you see the people in El Paso having to pick up the pieces of broken humanity, not just from the consequences of not having a robust federal policy of to responding to COVID-19, but also having to respond to the devastating consequences of immigration policies, and also we're going to connect this to the question of resources. If we think about the policing and the billions of dollars that are spent, not just in border security and in immigration detention, but also in policing American citizens, when we think about the budgets of local law enforcement and state law enforcement, that's all money that is not going to public health and to public education. And I'm also gripped by thinking about the brutal murder of George Floyd. And what was revealed after more studies of the tapes and of the police body cameras, that some of the fear that he was expressing was not wanting to be arrested and go to jail, because he knew that there were outbreaks in the local prisons. And so we also have to think about the longer history of police violence, of people dying in police custody, the hard work that social justice advocates have had to long taken on try to convince public audiences that the brutality could not continue. And we're seeing it today, that we're seeing that prisons, detention centers are drastically under-resourced, that not only people who are detained and imprisoned are experiencing outbreaks in these prisons, but then that the people who work at those prisons then move back and are walking amongst community members and going to church and going to grocery stores and living at home with their families. And so I think that this is a moment for us to think about the consequences of how deeply entrenched this idea of myself and the other. And how for many people in too many nations, disassociate themselves from people who they deem as foreign, or people who they deem as a criminal racial other. And also to think of the ironies that one thing that is starkly different is that in this moment, the United States is largely seen as the site of infection. And so Americans can't travel to Canada or to other nations. And so that is one thing that is starkly different from the period of racial violence that I studied 100 years ago.
Thank you, Monica. I feel like the four of you collectively have put so many things on the table, and this very rich tapestry is being woven. But let me turn it over to Ellie to ask a question that I think links to what Monica was just saying.
Yes, perfectly, actually. Thank you all. The aspect came up in all of your previous remarks, but I want to kind of dig into that a little bit deeper, especially as already has been mentioned. An aspect of the current crisis is the Black Lives Matter movement protest of state violence, which raises against the backdrop of the pandemic and the risk of infection, also the question, what is the role of the state, like historically, in preserving the health of the citizens, but also threatening them. Because we see, I mean, police violence is a very obvious example, but you have also touched upon the policies of disease prevention, which do make obvious differences. So could you focus on that aspect in your responses a little bit more? And I'll ask Manuela to go first, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you. I would say that most states in the world today emerged as racial states that were basically created by excluding the racialized minorities from rights. And many of them to this day remain racial states. It's either they emerged as racial states because their border were drawn by foreign colonial powers, or because they drew borders around their accumulated wealth. But precisely the states that became wealthy thanks to the spoils of colonialism were created around the exclusion of the populations that they racialized as non-European, non-white, non-Western from rights, and healthcare was a very big part of these kinds of rights. And that is still not only kind of the target for many people trying to cross borders today, not so much as it is said, illegal border crossing for criminal reasons, which is exactly the kind of policing discourse, state discourse that immediately emerges. But a lot of the border crossings happen in order to access healthcare, to access safe housing, safe healthcare, or some kind of medical treatment. And that, I think, also maybe the work of Monica speaks directly to that. One of the examples that's always striking to me is that how a few years ago, the state of Texas stopped issuing birth certificates to children born on its territory to undocumented migrants with a Mexican passport, making it impossible for parents to authorize medical treatment for their children or enroll them in daycare or school, which of course is related to the whole discourse on the so-called anchor babies, the idea that it is because of the possibility to gain citizenship that pregnant women cross the border into the United States, whereas most of them have legal documents. They're trying to access healthcare. And then turning that one right, which is an existential right, into something that can be criminalized as a type of migration, not a type of accessing the same rights that everybody's trying to access, is for me very interesting in terms of how the state becomes a distributor of class privilege, because there is actually a very systematic birth tourism, so to say, not only into the United States, but into many wealthy countries, where people do exactly that. They are trying, so countries that give citizenship to children born on their territory, as a wealthy investor or migrant, you can book yourself into a hotel, wait until you give birth, and have your child become a citizen, which is happening with a lot of, especially Russian families in the United States, many of whom book themselves into Trump hotels, ironically, and that is not a problem. And that is also not criminalized as a type of birth tourism or anchor babies, although decidedly and explicitly, the women who are interviewed are saying, this is what I'm doing. I'm trying to get US citizenship for my child because it's a better citizenship than the Russian one. In terms of the poor or the labor migrants who are trying to access the same rights, but are not wealthy investors, and they do not pay huge checks in order to access that right, the criminalization happens immediately on a kind of racialized pattern. These are the dirty migrants that we don't want to have, and they are only trying to abuse our citizenship right. So there, for me, the state is a very crucial factor in kind of distributing rights selectively, although the very idea of citizenship is one of distributing universal rights. So the contradiction is built in, but it's not only built in, it has a colonial history that makes it possible to build it in, because the very idea, at least in the United States, of the 14th Amendment giving birth to children, giving citizenship to children born on the territory, had to do with excluding Native American populations. So it's inextricable from the history of colonialism, from the history of racism. So healthcare is racialized.
Thank you. I think that Monica was nodding a lot, so maybe do you want to respond to that, or yeah, say something about that?
Sure. Again, there's a lot to say, and you know, I sort of thought in advance what I might contribute to this panel, and then with everybody's contributions, it's of course just taken me in lots of different directions. I mean, I think one thing that's important to remember too is that to come back to thinking about policing in the United States, the use of police to suppress civil rights movements and the use of police to suppress calls for basic human rights throughout the 20th century. And so, you know, I can think about in particular in 1919, there was confronting the state of Texas, you know, the NAACP and anti-lynching activists were calling on the state and also pressuring the federal government to pass anti-lynching legislation. You know, we can think about this, you know, Ida B. Wells described the lynching crisis as a social ill, right? That this was that the population of the United States were sick because we had this pandemic of lynchings across the United States, and so they were drawing on that language to try to call people to consciousness, to call people to ask for an end to lynching cultures, not just in their communities, but also to call on state and federal government powers to act. In the same era, you also saw in Texas, you know, the only Texas state representative who was Mexican American calling for a state congressional investigation into violent policing by Texas Rangers, by the state police. And there's an investigation, crimes by these police, murders, people being murdered in police custody, become a part of the public record. But there's state lawyers call on politicians and local residents to say, to again, participate in this criminalizing rhetoric and actually dismissing police violence by saying you've got to use this kind of brutality on Black and brown bodies. And so that the logic of white supremacy continued to be used and celebrated by the state as a reason to use force. And so what you see then, the consequences of that is that law enforcement continue to be emboldened and continue to police brown and Black bodies, and more specifically to target those groups that were trying to call for systematic change. In our context today, we can see similar actions, the failure to hold police accountable for committing abuse, for people dying in their custody, for inhumane conditions in places of detention. And we see the risks that people are having to take to try to call for social change, right? But the people protesting, people participating in the Black Lives Matter movement are criminalized by right-wing media, by the president, by the current administration, as threats to democracy, as causing chaos. And so while those people in the midst of a pandemic are having to put their lives at risk to call for basic reforms, to call for police to stop murdering people in their custody, it harkens back to the longer history of the burden on people of color and the most vulnerable people to literally put their lives at risk to try to make social change. And so I think it's important for us to think about that longer history, but again, to think about you know, the question of health here is also important, because on the one hand, we've seen the denial of resources for people in prisons and in detention centers so that they have access to things like social distancing or masks or places to wash their hands. And in contrast, you see federal resources being used, the reports now exposing women in immigration detention centers being forcibly sterilized. And so that's a use of taxpayer funds for sterilization campaigns that have nothing to do with saving lives of protecting people from COVID, but actually being used. And this also comes back to the chilling reality that eugenic logic, eugenic beliefs on what bodies need to be controlled, what bodies the federal government wants to prevent from reproducing. This ties back to Manuela's point about what children are deemed to be worthy of American citizenship. All of those contradictions are laid bare in our current moment and by these examples of women being forcibly sterilized in US custody.
Thank you so much, Monica. I think now I'm torn, but I think it speaks to Teresa's and Kathryn's work very nicely. But Kathryn, would you go next?
I'll go very quickly because I want to hear what Teresa has to say very much on this. So so again, this is, history can provide, I think, a lot of hints and answers today, but there are sort of limited comparisons. But okay, so if we go back 200 years ago, so New Orleans was the hub of this, of the America's slave society, of the Cotton Kingdom. So what exactly is the state? I think about this question a lot. What does it mean to be the state in a slave society? So the state limited it personally, or the constituent members of the state chose this approach to government, which is that it would do very little to help people stay alive. And then once people sort of passed this yellow fever threshold, white people that is, then it would help them protect private property, and it would help grease the wheels of this of the cotton slaving and sugar economies. That was sort of what the government elected to do. And these are not professional politicians for the most part. These are slave owners. These are very wealthy merchants who sort of also are politicians. These are the labels they take on. So quite literally, the state is, these are slaveholders. This is the state in this time. And the state's interest in was in keeping enslaved people alive solely because, and I have dozens of sources which talk about this, not because it's a human tragedy when a person dies, but because as embodied capital, enslaved people quite literally represented the loss of capital to a white person if they died. And it is always talked about in this very, very cold, unbelievably cruel language, or totally dehumanizing language. So on this, there are very few sort of firsthand sources that still exist, which speak to which from enslaved people in their own words, unmediated by white voices, about their experiences with yellow fever and their experiences in living in this deathscape and what it was like. It was, of course, petrifying. Enslaved people were petrified like everybody else of this disease. And I have many examples of enslaved people from Virginia and Kentucky, for example, who've been sold, it was called downriver, to New Orleans, who were fearful of coming here precisely because of yellow fever and precisely because they've heard stories of just how lethal this virus is and was. And it must have been, horribly, horribly complicated to also know that your sickness and suffering can be monetized, that it can be quite literally, this goes to the question of labor that Manuela was talking about earlier, that this is, you are seen as a laborer, and that if you are immune, if you become acclimated, that this becomes white capital somehow. This becomes the capital of another person. And that must be horribly complicated. And one small thing on this too, I think what we're seeing globally right now with the protests, these were the conditions of the pandemic set the scene for these global protests against racism. And I've seen this in my own work too, where it's not an accident that not everyone, but a large number of slave revolts and resistance takes place in the context of epidemics. This is often when white society was at its sort of weakest and most dispersed, when politicians had fled town and the police had fled town, when people were dying and when they were sick. I think that it's not an accident, in fact, that this is the moment in which this was a moment that many enslaved people in the 19th century saw to strike a blow against white supremacy in the slave society. I think, and it doesn't quite connect entirely to the current moment, but I think it's fascinating when disease sort of creates the conditions through which we can see all of the inequalities in our society so plainly, and they're so present and in our face already. And this also means that hopefully, I think with hope, these can be moments when we can also really change things too. When we can at least sort of think about large picture, what should change and how do we do that? If we're going to sort of, how can we reset many of these existing, pre-existing sort of conditions, these pre-existing inequalities? So it's obviously, I can see some hope, at least in that, cross fingers.
Yes, thank you so much, Kathryn. Teresa, would you like to respond to that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. There are so many things on my mind now. I think I will just pick up two. I think it is interesting to see that everywhere the situation of the pandemic put the relations between state and citizen at stake. And in Germany, for many people, in Western Germany, to be more precise, it means that for the first time in their life, they feel that there is a state. Because if you have grown up in the in the heart of the West German economic wonder, as it is called, the Wirtschaftswunder, or in the generations that followed, the state was basically an infrastructure that made your life run smoothly. But it very rarely interfered with your personal plans, and it could be expected at best to even support them. And suddenly people feel, yeah, there is a state and there is a monopoly of force, and the state can actually force you to stay at home, and it can punish or sanction you if you go outside. And I think it is in the post-war context in Western Germany, it is different in Eastern Germany because there people have experience with authoritarian state. But in West Germany, it is I think a very particular experience, which is also of particular relevance. And what I would like to highlight is that the state defines life chances of people, not only in the sense of healthcare, access to healthcare or not, but also in the way of access to support structures, for example, and other structures that would make run life now. So in Germany, a big issue now is what happens in schools. And the short answer is not much. So if you ever needed proof that schools are not very high on the agenda of political, in the political sphere, you have it now because you see that people there have to work under conditions that are not worthy of such a rich nation as Germany is. But you will see that there are families who can compensate this lack of proper education in school, using their private funds, paying for extra lessons and so on. And you can already see who is falling out of the system. And it's, of course, those who are always falling out of the system. And this is also a way of determining life chances, not only immediately in the sense of healthcare, but in the long run, which personally I find very worrying. And I would like to highlight another point, which also picks up on something that has been asked in the Q&A. I think thinking of state action, I think it's also good to look beyond states at political authority in the international or global sphere. Because thinking of healthcare, and looking at how certain epidemics or diseases are dealt with, we will see a racialized forms of knowledge production. So there are very elaborate products now which might help you to reduce weight or prevent hair loss, but there is still nothing that actually cures malaria. And this has to do with the fact that malaria was successfully fought as a disease in Europe and like the northern states. And it is a disease that now basically affects countries in the global south. And knowledge production in the medical sphere is geared towards markets too. And where there is no market, you will see much less efforts to produce medicines, effective medicines. And that brings me again to this question of how actually knowledge is produced, and how this longue durée of the colonial and imperial system is inscribed into structures of knowledge, because there has been a SARS outbreak in China a couple of years before. And everybody could be today much wiser how to deal with this situation if this would have been considered as a scenario that might become relevant. And I say now in what is this, guillemets, I say for us, but it was considered as a problem of China. And why should US or in Germany, researchers in Germany, companies in Germany deal with something that does not affect them? And this is, I think the current situation raises awareness for this, for these kinds of problems. I'm not so optimistic whether it will help to change the situation, because one thing the epidemic does and the pandemic does, and now we can see this already, is on the side of the state and power structures, is a renationalization of all kinds of policies. The potential to actually expand knowledge on a global scale to facilitate these cooperations that will facilitate global learning processes. I see the conditions for this rather diminishing than augmenting, although the sense of the problem is rising.
So incredibly, we only have 10 minutes left to our panel. So, I mean, it's amazing to think about the pandemic as, you know, the virus doesn't know nation state borders, but the function seems to be this kind of renationalization in terms of the response. So in terms of audience questions, what we thought we would do, Ellie and I, was give the panelists the opportunity to respond to any of a series of questions I'm going to very quickly ask and make concluding remarks in the remaining 9 minutes. Okay, so one question is about what Teresa was just speaking about, which was the role of international regional organization in relation to the history of state violence and health, thinking about, for example, Frontex, in addition to what Teresa was just saying. Second question, could the current response, in particular to the US, but not only the US, in response to Corona, be considered in relationship to the concept of racial hygiene of the late 19th, early 20th century? And then lastly, could you elaborate a bit more on the discursive connections between racism and medicalized language? For example, the other as a diseased or parasite, and then comparing racism to diseases such as cancer or mental disorders. So racism actually is a form of disease that's impacting bodies. So let me perhaps first turn to Kathryn, and then Monica, and then Manuela, and then Teresa, in that order, and then we'll conclude.
So I think just to sort of conclude a couple of thoughts here too, and this has been an absolutely thrilling conversation that I wish could go on for another 10 hours with wine. So I think we like to think about things like epidemiology and biology and germs and mosquitoes and viruses as these objective sort of unthinking actors. And they are, you know, these are objective things to a certain degree. It's humans, of course, who make them into discriminatory sort of vectors in this way. So humans are very, very good, I think, at manipulating unthinking biology into social forces, and sometimes creating crises that exacerbate economic asymmetries and enhance inequalities on many different levels, to do with gender, to do with race, to do with ethnicity, to do with nationality, et cetera. I think we've seen this, not just, I'll stick to the United States context, this certainly applies in the American South with yellow fever, where you know, I think this question, this last question that was asked by the audience too, about the sort of the discursive element of disease. You know, this is abolitionists constantly charged. They said that, you know, yellow fever epidemics struck the South because this was God's punishment for the disease of slavery. And likewise, enslavers turned this language around and said that, you know, it was the disease of abolitionism. They were the abolitionists. Slavery was safe, and, you know, and it was completely safe, and enslaved people were happy, except for when the contagion of abolitionism came in from the outside. And this is sort of the metaphor of race and racism and disease. These are, you know, they're almost indistinguishable from one another in my context. I think we've seen this also. I'll just add, you know, this has happened with many different diseases. most certainly with HIV/AIDS, most certainly with Ebola in recent times too. It feels almost obvious to point out the sort of ways that these diseases have been racialized, and that the people with them or seen to be sort of the vectors of this disease are otherized. But it's not an accident, I think, that there's a very, very long history of seeking to both otherize disease and doing it so on racial terms, doing it through the discourse and the rhetoric of the racial other. Because I think that this is, as everyone has in fact spoken about, and Teresa spoke about so eloquently, this becomes the sort of, racism becomes almost, you see this a lot in history with, it becomes sort of naturalized almost in the language of empirical science, that, it's because it's objective, because it's, people will say this, therefore it's natural, and therefore it's logical, therefore it's, it's justified. And I think that we're seeing that once again today, and I wish we wouldn't, but it's almost, these things are these sort of, what we are associating with the massive racisms of the way that this pandemic is taking place, not just in the United States, but in the United States, around the world, but in the United States, this has happened before, and it doesn't need to be like this. In fact, it really does not need to be like this. I think actually, as we're talking about the state intervening to, for the first time in many people's lives, as Teresa was just talking about, this could be, it could be for the good. I hope on Tuesday we'll see an improvement on that front.
Wow. Okay. Very quickly, since we have 5 more minutes, Monica, Manuela, Teresa. Thank you.
Just very quickly, I mean, I think that was a great encapsulation, Kathryn, of the conversation that we've been having. I think 2 points. Absolutely, yes, that the rhetoric, the discursive practices of describing foreigners or racial and ethnic minorities as dangerous to the national health, using the metaphor of the body of America, is something that has been long used. And especially when thinking about immigration policies and policing policies, that the need to control the movement of bodies is something that was embraced by white Americans. And so that's something that we can be critical of today, because we see the contradictions of the consequences of some white Americans, or just Americans in general, that hold on to this belief that we can see the roots of manifest destiny, that they are ordained by God to be able to move freely, and to, especially with the movement of Anglo-Americans west through conquest and colonization, that we see the roots of that today in some people's claims that they have a right not to have to wear masks and not to abide by social distancing guidelines. So I think that we're seeing the deadly consequences of that, and it's unfortunate that we are living through such skyrocketing rates of the pandemic, of people suffering from COVID-19. I also think that it's important that although we can be critical of state governments for their neglect, right? President Woodrow Wilson 100 years ago neglected to act in response to the Spanish flu in the 1918 epidemic, and he refused to speak about it in public speeches. And so it's another crippling part of history that is repeating today. He also refused to act to suppress mob violence and police violence, and to put individual responsibility onto states and local communities to try to end the spread of mob violence, knowing full well, being from the South, that was not going to change the course of history. And so we are really living in a moment where people have to hold elected officials and people in power accountable for acting or not acting, and also recognizing that they certainly, that inaction is a powerful act that has devastating consequences.
Thank you, Monica. Manuela, and then Teresa.
Yes, I'll try to be brief as well, just to address the question of whether the current state action and policy, not only but particularly in the US, can be considered as serving to the idea of racial hygiene as in the late 19th and early 20th century. And Of course, that speaks to the parallels that we've drawn here to different historical epochs, and I love how much we can learn from drawing parallels and comparing. But I think when we talk about racism, what we have to realize is that the longue durée of racism that Teresa was also mentioning makes not only comparison possible and necessary, but that there's a cumulative effect to it. So that once there is a longue durée of racism of at least 500 years, you don't even need to reinvent or to reproduce a specific attitude such as the project of racial hygiene, because the pattern of doing so is already there. And having done that still has effects today. So what you actually need to do, or you fail to do, is just neglect any action to mitigate effects on already unequal and already stratified populations, and they're stratified by race. So in the case of the US, really, I don't think that action is that systematic on the part of the current administration. So I think it would be too presumptuous to call this a project of racial hygiene, because it's a mess. It's all over the place. It's not a project. But because of the history of racism, it's easy for it to act in the same way because the cumulated effects are still there. And in different parts of the world it may be similar, and we haven't at all mentioned the situation of indigenous people in Brazil, for instance, and not only in Brazil, that have become now, or whose situation has become clear to more people because it has become such a stark tragedy that they are being affected by a pandemic before not having had any contact with people outside of their own context. So the fact that there is such a thing as inequalities being imposed again and again and again on structures that have been created a long time ago leads to such projects appearing similar to systematic projects of previous epochs without there necessarily having an explicit intent to do so, but the explicit intent being that they are being produced or reproduced under global capitalism.
Thank you so much, Manuela. Final word from Teresa.
Yeah, thank you. I think I would like to pick up the last question that you mentioned, and this, which relates to this explosion also of epidemiological metaphors that we could have observed during the weeks of the pandemic and the month. So is racism a disease? Or does it make sense to talk in these terms? And if we do this, what we do actually is we use a medicalized language to describe a certain process, and medicalization is always a form of naturalization. So it is a narrative of that this is something that happens natural, that is not intentional, and I would not, I would not criticize this kind of discourse in a general sense, because I have seen, especially in post-war societies, how these kinds of discourses can have a positive function. For example, in Mozambique, people have talked about the war as something that befell them. And then this helped communities that were composed of perpetrators and victims, or of people who had fought on different sides during the war. This naturalizing language helped them to find ways of coexisting again, because then they had been befallen by the same thing. So I don't want to denounce this language in general, but I would say if we talk about racism in these ways, it is always a kind of an exculpatory discourse. So even in this context that I just described for a post-war society, the function of this kind of discourse is exculpatory. So it's not people's fault. It happened to them. And in the political sphere, in the sphere of public discourse, I would always argue against using this kind of language to engage with a problem that has a long history, that has a lot to do with also actually, as I said, pre-conscious processes, but we have to address them consciously, and we have to hold people responsible even for actions that that are not intentional, but hurtful anyways. And if I act in ways that hurt other people, even if it is not my intention to hurt, I have to take responsibility. And what this means in practice can be many things, but this is something that I think is important. So help to hold people accountable is the basis for engaging in purposeful discussions about these topics.
Thank you, Teresa. We are, unfortunately, and I can only second what has been said by you and also by attendees in the Q&A. It's very sad that this ends at this point because you offered intriguing perspectives. I also want to thank the convening institutions for giving us the opportunity to have this conversation, which I think will only gain relevance as the current crisis takes time and time again new and interesting turns and twists and offers new perspectives on racism. For today, thanks to all of you, thanks to the panelists, thanks to Leti, thanks to Heike Friedman, who has run the event in the background. And we close here and hope to hear more from you in the future. Thank you so much.